The night Camille Westbrook invited 5 of New York's most powerful men into her home, she was absolutely certain of one thing. Her blind 9-year-old daughter would finally have a father worth having. She was wrong about everything that followed. Sophie ignored the surgeon, ignored the hotel magnate, ignored all 5 men standing in their expensive suits with their expensive smiles. Then she heard a voice in the hallway, a man in a janitor's uniform, and walked straight to him with both arms open. "I choose Cole." The room went silent, and nobody in that ballroom understood what Sophie already knew. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us for a while, you already know we don't do ordinary stories on this channel. We do the ones that stay with you. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. Because trust me, you do not want to walk into the next story cold. Drop a like if you're already feeling this one, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I read them, every single one. It matters more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's talk about Camille Westbrook, a woman who thought she had everything figured out, and a little girl who could not see a single thing in that room except the truth. The Westbrook mansion sat on the northern edge of Manhattan, like something out of an architectural magazine, all glass and pale stone, 12,000 square feet of deliberate perfection, with a garden terrace that overlooked the city lights. Camille had bought it 3 years after her husband's death because the apartment they had shared together smelled like him for months after the funeral, and she could not keep walking past his reading chair. The mansion had no reading chair. That was the point. On the evening of the gathering, the house had been prepared with the kind of precision that Camille applied to everything: fresh flowers in the entryway, caterers in the kitchen, soft lighting in the main reception room that made everyone look slightly better than they actually were. She had thought of everything. That was her skill. Running Westbrook Industries, a company she had rebuilt from the ground up after her husband Marcus left it wobbling on its foundations, had taught her that the difference between success and disaster was almost always preparation. What she had not prepared for was Sophie. Sophie Elizabeth Westbrook, 9 years old, born with a degenerative condition that had taken most of her functional vision by the time she was 4, and the rest of it by the time she turned 6, sat in her bedroom upstairs while Camille made final checks in the reception room. Sophie wore her good dress, navy blue with small white buttons, the one she insisted on choosing herself every time, even though she selected it purely by feel. She kept her collapsible cane resting across her knees and listened to the sounds of the house, the way some children watch television, attentively, with complete focus, reading meaning into everything. She could hear the caterers moving in the kitchen. She could hear Camille's heels on the marble floor below. She could hear the low murmur of a man's voice near the front entrance, then another, then the polished baritone of someone who spoke like he was accustomed to being listened to. Sophie tilted her head. She was not excited. Downstairs, Camille straightened her dress in the hallway mirror and did the thing she always did before something important. She took one breath, released it slowly, and reminded herself that she was Camille Westbrook. She had restructured a failing company. She had buried her husband at 32 and kept going. She had raised a blind child alone in a city that moved fast and asked no one to wait. She could host one dinner. The 5 men were already present when she entered the reception room. She had been careful in her selections. Not reckless, not romantic, but careful, the way she approached acquisitions. Each man had been considered over several months. She knew their financial histories, their professional reputations, their prior relationships. One was Dr. Elliot Marsh, a cardiovascular surgeon with 2 grown children and a quietly charitable life that showed up in his tax records more than his conversations. One was Harrison Foyle, who owned a collection of boutique hotels across the East Coast and had the good sense not to mention it constantly. There was Jonathan Reeve, a quietly formidable investment manager with 20 years of reliable judgment. Then Raymond Cross, whose family had been in New York real estate for 3 generations. And finally, Graham Whitfield, a recently retired federal judge whose reputation for integrity was the kind of thing that showed up in profile pieces people actually read. Good men, all of them. Accomplished, solvent, mature enough to understand that what Camille needed was not romance in the conventional sense. She needed a partner. And Sophie needed, Camille chose her words carefully, even in her own thinking, Sophie needed a consistent adult male presence in her life, who would not treat her as a problem to manage. She introduced each man to Sophie individually, in the small sitting room adjacent to the main hall. Sophie sat in her chair, cane upright, expression politely neutral. Dr. Marsh brought Sophie a small music box that played a melody when wound. He explained it carefully, clearly proud of the thoughtfulness. "Thank you," Sophie said. She set it on the table beside her and did not touch it again. Harrison Foyle told Sophie about the hotel he owned in Vermont that backed up against a mountain. He described the sound of wind through the pines in a way that was genuinely lyrical for about 30 seconds before he pivoted to mentioning its occupancy rates. Sophie nodded. Jonathan Reeve, to his credit, said almost nothing. He sat across from Sophie for a few minutes and asked her a single question. "What do you think about when you're trying to fall asleep?" Sophie looked toward him with the particular stillness she had when she was actually paying attention. "I listen to the building," she said. "The pipes, the elevator, whether anyone's walking around." "That sounds exhausting," he said. "Sometimes," Sophie said. It was the best conversation of the evening, and it lasted 4 minutes. Raymond Cross brought a basket of things he had been told blind children enjoyed: textured objects, a bar of scented soap, a carved wooden bird. He explained each item with the careful enthusiasm of a man who had clearly done research but not spoken to many 9-year-olds. Sophie ran her fingers over the wooden bird and said it was nice. She meant it, actually. But when Raymond left the room, she set the bird beside the music box without looking back. Graham Whitfield was kind, direct, and reminded Sophie immediately of her 3rd-grade teacher, which she mentioned out loud. Whitfield laughed, genuinely, not the laugh of a man performing ease, and said he had been told that before. He asked about her cane, what kind it was, whether she had preferences, how she'd learned to use it. Sophie answered him honestly. He listened. He did not try to tell her anything she already knew. Camille watched all of it from a careful distance, reading Sophie's face the way she had learned to over 9 years of parenting a child who expressed most things through posture and stillness rather than expression. After Whitfield excused himself, Sophie sat in the sitting room alone for a moment. Camille came in quietly and sat across from her. "What do you think?" "They're all trying very hard," Sophie said. "That's not necessarily a bad thing." "I know." Sophie's fingers moved on the top of her cane. "They're trying hard at the wrong things." Camille did not press. She had learned not to press Sophie on first impressions. The girl processed slowly and accurately, and interrupting the process never improved the results. They moved into the main gathering for dinner. The 5 men were gracious, conversation was civilized, the food was excellent. Camille watched Sophie sit at the table and eat carefully and respond when spoken to, and she noticed what she always noticed. Her daughter was not present in the room, even when she was physically in it. Sophie had retreated somewhere inside herself, listening to things nobody else could hear, drawing conclusions nobody had access to. The evening moved toward its close. Camille was already composing next steps in her mind. Second meetings, one-on-one time, a slower process, when it happened. From the hallway, on the other side of the partially closed ballroom door, came the sound of a utility cart being maneuvered past. Metal wheels on marble. Then a quiet voice, talking to itself or perhaps to no one, humming something low and tuneless while checking something on a clipboard. Sophie's head came up like a compass needle finding north. She stood from her chair. "Sophie?" Camille started. Sophie was already moving, cane extended, navigating the room with a confidence that still sometimes stopped Camille's heart, because it looked so effortless and was anything but. She reached the ballroom door and pushed through it and disappeared into the hallway. Camille was on her feet immediately, the 5 men registering confusion behind her, and when she reached the door and looked into the hall, she saw her daughter standing with her arms wrapped completely around a man's midsection. The man was wearing a gray maintenance uniform with the Westbrook Industries Building Services logo on the chest. He was crouching slightly, one hand awkwardly suspended at his side, clearly startled, the utility cart still rolling slowly away from where he'd left it. "Hey," he said. His voice was low, a little rough at the edges. "Hey, Sophie, you okay?" "I'm okay," Sophie said into his uniform. She did not let go. Camille stood in the doorway. The man looked up and saw her, and his expression shifted into something careful and steady. Not guilty, not defensive, just present. He straightened slightly as much as Sophie would allow, and said, "Mrs. Westbrook, I'm sorry, I was just finishing the 3rd floor. I didn't realize—" "I know who you are," Camille said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. Cole, building services. Yes, ma'am. Sophie. Camille kept her voice even. Come back inside, sweetheart. We have guests. Sophie's grip on Cole's uniform did not loosen. She turned her face toward her mother's voice, and what Camille saw in her daughter's expression, that particular settling, that quality of having arrived somewhere, was something she had not seen all evening. I choose Cole, Sophie said. Behind Camille, the five men had drifted to the doorway. A surgeon, a hotel owner, an investment manager, a real estate heir, a retired federal judge. All of them watching a 9-year-old girl in a navy dress cling to a janitor in a maintenance uniform and make the simplest, most complete announcement Camille had ever heard her make. Camille did not move for a long moment. There was something unfamiliar happening in her chest, somewhere between embarrassment and something she couldn't name yet. The embarrassment made sense. The something else took longer to locate. She had been so certain of this evening. She had organized it the way she organized everything, which was carefully and completely, and Sophie had looked at her work and walked past all of it. Cole, Camille said finally, could you give us a few minutes? Of course. He looked down at Sophie. Hey, I'm not going anywhere, I'm just going to finish the hallway, all right? Sophie finally loosened her grip. You'll still be here? Third floor needs the supply closet restocked. Takes a while. He said it matter-of-factly, like a man who did not expect to be thanked for anything he said. I'll be around. Sophie nodded. She let go. Camille watched Cole Barrett push his cart down the hallway without looking back, and she tried to understand what she had just witnessed. He moved without performance, no glance over his shoulder to gauge her reaction, no careful posture for the benefit of the audience of wealthy strangers watching him from a doorway. He rounded the corner and was gone, and the hallway felt ordinary again, and Sophie stood with her cane and her hand resting against the wall and her face turned toward where his footsteps had been. Comes inside, Camille said gently. I already told you who I choose, Sophie said. I heard you. Camille touched her daughter's shoulder. Come eat dessert. Later, after the guests had left and Sophie had been put to bed and the caterers had packed their equipment into 2 white vans that disappeared down the private drive, Camille sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking and tried to make sense of the evening in the way she made sense of everything, which was to organize the facts. Fact. Sophie had spent the evening with 5 men who were, by any measurable standard, exceptional. Fact. Sophie had chosen a man who cleaned offices for a living. Fact. The expression on Sophie's face when she reached Cole had been the most uncomplicated thing Camille had seen from her daughter in longer than she could accurately remember. She pulled up Cole Barrett's employee file on her phone. She had access to every personnel file in Westbrook Industries. Not because she monitored her employees, but because, after what happened to Marcus, she had made it a habit to know the people in her building. Cole Barrett, age 37, hired 14 months ago, clean record. Attendance, near perfect, with 1 day missed following a school event for his daughter. Performance reviews from 2 supervisors described him as reliable, thorough, and quiet. One review said, does more than required without drawing attention to it. His previous employment history before Westbrook Industries was thin, almost suspiciously thin. 10 years reduced to a single line, prior government service. Camille set her phone down on the kitchen counter. She looked out the window at the dark garden, the city lights beyond the wall. Her daughter, the one who had always read people like a language most adults had forgotten how to speak, had looked past every careful thing Camille had assembled and found the one person she had not invited. Camille did not know what that meant yet. She knew it meant something. She picked up her phone again, not to research Cole Barrett, but to write a note to herself in the way she always recorded things that required further consideration. She typed, Sophie chose him, find out why. Then she put the phone face down and finally drank some of her tea, which had gone cold. The note Camille wrote to herself that night, Sophie chose him. Find out why. Sat in her phone unopened for 3 days before she did anything about it. That was not like her. Camille Westbrook was not a woman who let questions age. She investigated, she called people, she assembled information the way other people assembled furniture. Methodically, from the instructions outward, nothing left unaccounted for. But this particular question kept stopping her at the threshold because she wasn't sure what she was actually asking. Was she asking about Cole Barrett, the employee? Cole Barrett, the man? Or was she really asking what Sophie knew that she didn't, and whether that was something you could find in a personnel file. She eventually called Rita Huang, the head of building operations at Westbrook Tower. Rita had been with the company 11 years, had survived 2 restructurings and 1 hostile takeover attempt, and knew the physical building and everyone who worked in it with the thoroughness of someone who considered it a personal failing when anything needed a second repair. "Cole Barrett," Camille said. "Tell me about him." There was a pause on Rita's end that was not quite surprise but something adjacent to it. "Why? Is there a problem?" "No problem. I just want to know." Another pause. Rita was careful with her words around Camille, not out of fear but out of respect for precision. "He's the best person I have on nights," she said finally. "Doesn't miss things. Never has to be told twice. I've had him in the building 14 months, and I think I've had to follow up on something he did wrong exactly once, and that was because the supply order was wrong on our end, not his." "What do you know about his background?" "He keeps to himself. Has a daughter, a little girl. I've seen her once when she came by with a school project. Cute kid, very polite. Before us, he had some kind of government work. He's never been specific." Rita paused again. "He's not a complainer. Doesn't play politics. Honestly, he's the kind of worker that makes me nervous sometimes because I know eventually he's going to figure out he could be doing something else and he'll leave." Camille thanked her and ended the call. Government service. That phrase had been sitting in the back of her mind since she read the file, patient as a stone. There were 100 things it could mean, and a handful it most likely did, and she wasn't ready to pull that thread yet, not without more to go on. Instead, she did something less strategic and more honest with herself. She arranged to be in the building on a Thursday evening, which Rita had told her was one of Cole's standard shift nights, and she walked the 3rd floor alone. She found him restocking a supply closet near the east stairwell, working through a clipboard with a methodical efficiency that was almost meditative. He heard her coming. She realized he heard her before she expected him to, his shoulders adjusting almost imperceptibly, already oriented to the sound. And he turned without being startled. "Mrs. Westbrook." He held his clipboard at his side. Not stiff, just still. "I wanted to apologize," she said, "for the other night. I should have anticipated Sophie might encounter people from the building. That wasn't fair to you." "No apology needed," he said. "Sophie was fine." "She was more than fine," Camille said. "That's actually what I wanted to talk about. Do you have a few minutes?" He glanced at his clipboard with the look of a man mentally calculating what could be shuffled. "Sure." They ended up standing in the hallway because there was nowhere obvious to sit, which felt appropriately awkward given that Camille wasn't sure what she'd come to say. She asked him how he knew Sophie, and Cole explained it the way he apparently explained most things, plainly, without embellishment. It had happened about 8 months earlier. Sophie had come to the tower with her regular caregiver for a scheduled pickup, but the caregiver had been pulled into a conversation with Camille's assistant on the 2nd floor, and Sophie had been left in the 3rd floor lobby with assurances that someone would be right back. Then the elevator had malfunctioned briefly, the lights had flickered, and Sophie had lost her orientation in the unfamiliar reconfigured lobby. Maintenance had moved the furniture 2 days before, and she had gone still with the particular stillness of someone managing a fear response very carefully. Cole had been refilling paper in the copy room and seen her through the window. He'd come out slowly. He emphasized the word slowly, like it was important, and he hadn't announced himself loudly or touched her or told her not to worry. He'd crouched down about 4 feet away and said, "Hey, you okay?" Sophie had said, honestly, that she wasn't sure. And he'd said, "Okay. Can I ask you something? What are you here right now?" Camille watched Cole's face while he told this part. There was nothing performative in how he described it, no pride in the story. He was recounting a sequence of events the way you describe a repair you made. Here was the problem. Here was what I tried. She said she could hear the HVAC system and some footsteps on the floor above, Cole said. So I told her which direction the HVAC sound was coming from relative to where she was standing. Then I told her the elevator was about 30 feet straight ahead and that the main door was behind her left shoulder. I just gave her the room back, I guess. In sound. He shrugged slightly. She was fine after that. Her caregiver came back 2 minutes later. You taught her to orient by sound, Camille said. I reminded her she already could, he said. She didn't need teaching, she just needed the map. Camille looked at him for a moment. Where did you learn to think that way? Cole's expression did not change, exactly, but something behind it settled differently. You pick things up, he said. It was not an answer. She noted that. Sophie hasn't forgotten you, Camille said. She asks about you. I know. She stops by sometimes when she's in the building. He said it without any quality of boasting. She and Maddie have been talking. Maddie? My daughter, she's 8. Sophie found her in the lobby one afternoon when I had to bring her in. Couldn't find after-school coverage that day. They've been... He paused, and for the first time something on his face shifted towards something warmer. They've been having conversations that I'm apparently not supposed to know the content of. What age are they managing that kind of conspiracy? Camille said. 8 and 9, apparently. Something close to a smile. Sophie asked Maddie if she wanted to try using the cane. Maddie did. She walked into a water fountain. So. Camille found herself smiling before she'd made the decision to. She let it happen. Are you from New York originally? No, Virginia. Moved here when Maddie was 3. On your own? Yeah. He said it without opening any doors around it. Just the two of us. Camille understood there was a before she wasn't being shown. She respected the fence around it the way she'd want her own respected. Well, she said, Sophie's going to keep stopping by the building. I wanted you to know I don't mind that, if she's in the building and she finds you. She's welcome, Cole said simply. Maddie likes her. Maddie's not the only one, Camille said, and then immediately felt the statement land slightly sideways and added, Sophie doesn't take to people easily. You should know that. Cole nodded. I figured. She's careful. Very. Smart kid, he said. And it was not the comment of a man performing admiration. He meant it the way you mean something you've observed from a distance with respect. Camille left the building 20 minutes later with more questions than she'd arrived with, and found that she didn't mind. What followed happened in increments, the way most significant things do when nobody's forcing them. Sophie continued to seek Cole out whenever she was in the building with her caregiver, or, occasionally, with Camille herself. She did not make a production of it. She simply had a way of knowing when he was on the floor, tracking the sound of his cart, Camille assumed, or some other signal. Sophie's calibrated hearing picked up that the rest of them missed, and she would find him, and they would talk. Sometimes for 2 minutes, sometimes for 20. Cole never shortened his shift for these conversations, and never extended them past what made sense. He treated Sophie the way he'd apparently treated her from the first moment, like a person who was entirely capable of handling whatever came at her, which was, Camille was slowly realizing, exactly the opposite of how most people treated Sophie. Most people, even the good ones, even the ones who genuinely cared, made constant small adjustments around Sophie's blindness. They moved things without announcing they'd moved them, and then felt guilty. They described the room unnecessarily when Sophie hadn't asked. They offered hands she hadn't reached for. They looked at Camille when Sophie said something complex, checking whether the adult had caught it, as if Sophie couldn't be the primary audience for her own statements. Cole did none of this. He answered Sophie directly. He corrected her when she was wrong about something, and he was not gentle about it in the performative way of adults trying to preserve a child's feelings. He was direct in the way of someone who understood that being treated as capable was a form of respect. One afternoon, Camille came to collect Sophie from the 3rd floor and arrived 2 minutes early and stood unnoticed at the hallway corner, listening. Sophie was telling Cole about a problem she was having with her mobility instructor, a woman named Dr. Fenn, who had been working with Sophie for 2 years and whom Sophie had recently decided she knew better than. The argument, as Sophie laid it out, was that Dr. Fenn kept insisting Sophie slow down in unfamiliar spaces as a precaution, and Sophie felt this was both insulting and counterproductive. She wants you to slow down, Cole said. I know, she's wrong. What makes her wrong? Because slowing down means I lose the sound reflection. The faster I walk, the better I can read the space. A slower pace gives me less information. Silence for a moment. That's actually true, Cole said. I know it's true. But it's also true that faster gives you more information is also true when you're about to walk into a glass door. Sophie was quiet. The question isn't who's right, Cole continued. The question is whether you can tell the difference between a space you've already mapped and one you haven't. Can you? Yes, Sophie said, with a little less certainty than she'd started with. Then tell Dr. Fenn that. Don't tell her she's wrong. Tell her what you actually know about when the faster pace works and when it doesn't. She'll listen to data a lot faster than she'll listen to attitude. Sophie considered this. You sound like you've had that conversation before. More times than I can count, Cole said. With people who had a lot more power than Dr. Fenn. Camille did not move from the corner. She stood very still and felt something rearranging itself in how she had been thinking about the man 2 floors below her on the organizational chart. The wealthy candidates did not disappear immediately after the gathering. Camille, to her own mild embarrassment, had allowed 2 of them, Jonathan Reeve and Graham Whitfield, to maintain occasional contact. Not with any romantic momentum, but because she was a practical woman and she had told herself she was keeping options appropriately open. Jonathan occasionally sent her a thoughtful article about corporate governance. Graham had called once to recommend a book, which turned out to be genuinely good. These were low-pressure interactions that made no demands, and Camille told herself they cost nothing. Sophie tolerated this information with the diplomatic silence of a 9-year-old who had already made up her mind. Until the afternoon that Jonathan Reeves stopped by the mansion to drop off some documents. A professional errand, not a social call, or so Camille had characterized it to herself, and found Sophie in the entryway with her cane and her school bag. "Sophie," Jonathan said warmly. He crouched to her eye level, which was a habit most adults practiced around Sophie, and which she had told Camille she found slightly unnecessary. "How are you?" "Fine," Sophie said. She was tracking something, Camille could tell. Jonathan said something about her cane, asked if she'd been practicing her routes around the neighborhood. He was kind. He was genuinely trying. But there was something slightly amplified about his warmth in Camille's presence, a quality of performance so subtle that most adults wouldn't have noticed it. Sophie noticed. She turned her face toward her mother after Jonathan had gone into the study. "He talks differently when you're in the room," she said quietly. Camille almost asked what she meant. Then she didn't, because she had understood. That evening, after Camille put Sophie to bed and came back down to the kitchen, she thought about what Cole had said to Sophie in the hallway. Not the specific words, but the quality of them. The absence of audience in them. The way he spoke to Sophie the same way whether Camille was there or not. Whether he knew he was being overheard or not. Whether it served him in any observable way or not. She thought about that for a long time. Meanwhile, Maddie Barrett was becoming a presence in Sophie's life, with the organic stubbornness of someone who had decided on a friendship and saw no particular reason to negotiate about it. She was 8 years old, compact and opinionated, with a blunt conversational style that she had clearly inherited from her father. She arrived at the mansion for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in early November, dropped off by Cole before his Saturday shift with the cheerful lack of ceremony of someone who considered this a completely normal arrangement. Camille had agreed to it, though she was still slightly unsure how it had happened. Sophie had mentioned that Maddie wanted to see the garden terrace. Specifically, Sophie had told Maddie about the sound the wind made through the iron trellis, how it changed pitch depending on the direction. And somehow this had converted into Maddie being dropped off at 10 in the morning with a backpack and a water bottle and an absence of apparent nervousness. Camille watched the 2 girls from the kitchen window. Maddie walked straight up to the trellis and put her ear against the iron the way Sophie had apparently instructed, and then she said something that made Sophie laugh so hard she had to put her hand on the trellis to stay upright. Camille could not hear what was said. She didn't try to. She watched her daughter laugh. The real kind. The kind that wasn't performed for adults, and felt it somewhere old and deep in her chest. Cole came to collect Maddie at 4. He parked a car that had 130,000 miles on it and probably needed new brake pads, judging by the sound it made slowing down the drive. Camille noticed things like that. She was her father's daughter in that way. And he came to the door and Maddie threw her backpack at him as a greeting. "How was she?" he asked, meaning his daughter, but looking at Camille with the professional courtesy of a man on a job site. "Perfect," Camille said. "Sophie wants her back next week." "Works for me." He pulled Maddie's jacket up over her shoulder where it had slipped. "Say thank you." "Thank you," Maddie said, but she was already saying it to Sophie, not to Camille, which Camille found correct. Sophie stood in the doorway and said, "Next Saturday. Same trellis." "Same trellis," Maddie confirmed. "And I'm bringing headphones so we can listen to music at the same time, except I'll play mine out loud so you can hear it too." "That's not how headphones work," Sophie said. "I know that. It was a joke." "It wasn't a very good one." "Yeah," Maddie said cheerfully. See you Saturday. Cole herded his daughter toward the car with one hand between her shoulder blades, and Camille watched them go with a feeling she couldn't entirely account for. It wasn't complicated, exactly. It was more like recognizing something she had stopped expecting to see. The Westbrook Industries Board noticed nothing of this. They were occupied, as they had been for 3/4 of the year, with the details of a pending acquisition. A mid-sized logistics firm called Hartwell Consolidated, whose infrastructure the board had identified as a strategic asset and whose purchase Camille had been methodically progressing through regulatory channels for 7 months. It was the largest deal Westbrook Industries had attempted since Camille's restructuring 5 years prior. It required everything: her attention, her legal team, her patience with a negotiation that moved like cold syrup. She gave it what it needed and compartmentalized the rest, which was her primary professional skill. Preston Vale, the board chairman, had been one of Camille's late husband's earliest appointments and had survived largely because he was procedurally useful and politically skilled in the way that certain men become politically skilled without ever becoming actually capable. He had opinions about everything and genuine authority over very little, but he exercised the former as if it conferred the latter. He was 61, maintained the look of a man who had once been athletic, and had cultivated over 2 decades a specific talent for making his preferences sound like institutional concerns. His preference, which he had expressed 3 times in the past 6 weeks with increasing specificity, was that Camille's personal choices were becoming a professional liability. He had not said janitor, he was too careful for that. But the word he was circling was obvious enough. There's a perception issue, he told her in a board pre-meeting in early December, the two of them alone in the conference room before the others arrived. I've had 2 investors mention it independently. The Hartwell deal needs to close cleanly, and right now there's noise. Noise, Camille said, about your household. He held her gaze with the practiced steadiness of a man who had prepared this speech. About who has access to your family. Camille set her coffee down on the table with the precise care she used when she was managing an impulse. Are you describing a security concern, Preston? Or a social one? I'm describing both, he said. I don't think they're separable. I think you should be very specific about what you're asking me to change. Preston recalibrated. She could see him doing it. I'm asking you to be thoughtful, he said, about appearances. I'm always thoughtful about appearances, Camille said. That's not the same as letting appearances make my decisions. He had backed down then, because he didn't have enough leverage yet, and they both knew it. But Camille had driven back to the mansion that evening with the particular alertness of someone who has heard a sound they can't yet identify, and she had stood in the kitchen where Sophie's drawings were stuck to the refrigerator with fruit-shaped magnets, and she had thought about Preston Vale's expression and what exactly he was protecting. She didn't have an answer yet, but she remembered something Cole had told Sophie in the hallway, which Sophie had repeated to her without knowing what it would mean. The question isn't who's right. The question is what you can tell the difference between. Camille thought about that late into the night. And then, 3 weeks before Christmas, something happened that turned the thinking into urgency. Cole arrived for his Thursday shift and found his building access card rejected at the main entrance. I tried it twice, the way people try things twice when they're certain there's been a mistake. The reader blinked red both times. He went to the security desk, and the overnight guard, a young man named Dennis, who had always gotten along fine with Cole, looked uncomfortable and said he'd received an email about an hour ago from building HR. Cole Barrett's access was suspended pending investigation. He wasn't supposed to let him in. Cole stood at the desk for a moment. Investigation into what? Dennis looked miserable. I don't have that information, man. I'm sorry. Cole nodded once. He took his card back. He walked to his car, sat in the parking lot, and called the building services line. He got a recording. He called Rita Huang's cell, which he had for genuine maintenance emergencies, and got voicemail. He sat in the parking lot for a while longer, in the cold, with the particular stillness of a man who had been in situations where panicking accomplished nothing and had learned this not philosophically, but practically. Then he drove home to Maddie. The call from HR came the next morning. Confidential documents related to the Hartwell acquisition had been found attached to an internal memo sent from Cole Barrett's employee account. He had no access to confidential documents. He had no access to the corporate server. He had, as far as anyone in building services was concerned, no idea what the Hartwell acquisition even was. But his employee credentials appeared in the security log, accessing a restricted floor at 11:47 on a Tuesday night 3 weeks prior, and the documents had been sent to an external address from his account at 11:52. Cole listened to all of this on the phone without interrupting. When the HR representative finished, Cole said, "I wasn't in the building on that Tuesday. I picked Maddie up from her after-school program at 5, and she had a fever by 7. We were home all night." "We'll look into that," the HR representative said, in the tone of someone who has already been told what conclusion to reach. "I'm sure you will," Cole said. He ended the call and sat in his kitchen while Maddie ate cereal across from him, and he looked at the table and felt the particular weight of a situation engineered by someone who had underestimated him, which was, he'd found, most situations. Camille found out from Rita Huang at 7 in the morning, 20 minutes after she'd dropped Sophie with her tutor. Rita called because she thought Camille would want to know, and also, Rita said carefully, because something about the documentation felt off to her. The access timestamps were clean. Rita had seen sloppy employees, clumsy employees, employees who made mistakes, and the pattern of a genuine security breach looked different from this. This looked too neat. Camille said she understood, thanked Rita, and immediately called Preston Vale. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting. "I heard," she said. "I was going to call you this morning," he said. "I'm sure you were." She kept her voice level. "What exactly was found, and where?" Preston explained. "Acquisition-related financial projections. Target company valuation models. The kind of documents that, in the wrong hands, could allow someone to position investments ahead of a public announcement." "That's insider information," Camille said. "Exactly," Preston said. "Which is why we need to move quickly and cleanly on termination. The last thing we need is this dragging into the new year with the deal still open." "We're not terminating anyone before we know what happened," Camille said. A pause. "Camille, I said we're not terminating anyone," she said. "We're investigating. Start there." She hung up. Then she sat in her car in the parking structure beneath her building, and she thought about a man who cleaned offices at night and drove a car with tired brakes, and had a daughter who brought headphones to share music she didn't actually own headphones for, and she thought about the 11:47 timestamp, and she thought about what Rita had said about the documents looking too clean, and she thought about Preston Vale picking up on the second ring. She thought about what Cole had told Sophie. She could only hear patience, consistency, truth. She picked up her phone and called her independent legal counsel. She did not call Preston back. And that was the morning everything that had been quietly accumulating beneath the surface of Westbrook Industries finally began to move toward the light, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The independent legal counsel Camille called that morning was a woman named Diane Cho, 54 years old, who had spent the first half of her career as a federal prosecutor and the second half doing the kind of corporate investigations that required both skill sets simultaneously. Camille had retained her 3 years ago for a contract dispute that never went to litigation because the other party had looked at Diane's name on the letterhead and settled within a week. Since then, Diane had handled 2 internal matters for Westbrook Industries, both quietly, both conclusively. And Camille trusted her the way she trusted very few people, based entirely on evidence. Diane listened to the situation without interrupting, which was her habit. When Camille finished, there was a pause. "Walk me through the access log exactly as it was described to you," Diane said. Camille did. Restricted floor. 11:47. Cole Barrett's credentials. Documents sent to an external address at 11:52, 5 minutes between access and transmission. 5 minutes, Diane said. Yes. Someone who knew what they were doing and exactly where to find the files could do it in 5 minutes, Diane said. Someone who had never been on that floor and didn't know the system couldn't. Which category does your employee fall into? Building services, Camille said. Night shift. He cleans offices. He's never had access to the executive floor. Then someone gave him access, or someone used his credentials. Another pause. And the documents that were sent, who outside the board would know those specific files existed, let alone where they were stored? That's what I keep coming back to, Camille said. Right. Diane was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was already working. Don't terminate. Don't let Preston Vale touch the investigation. And get me everything, the access logs, the email headers, the full security footage for that floor on that date, and Cole Barrett's HR file going back to hire. I'll have someone there this afternoon. There's one more thing, Camille said. Cole says he wasn't in the building that night. His daughter was sick. Can he document it? I'm going to ask him. After she hung up, Camille drove to the modest apartment building across town where the HR file said Cole Barrett resided, because calling felt insufficient for what she needed to say and what she needed to read in his face when he answered. He came to the door in a gray sweatshirt and jeans, and behind him she could hear a cartoon playing from another room. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that said he'd expected this visit without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Come in, he said. The apartment was small and clean in the functional way of someone who didn't have time for clutter but wasn't indifferent to order. A child's drawings were taped to the refrigerator in the kitchen, not arranged neatly, just taped wherever there was space. There was a half-assembled model of something on the coffee table that looked aeronautical, tools laid out on a folded newspaper beside it, a blanket on the couch that had clearly been slept under recently. Maddie appeared in the hallway. "Hi," she said, seeing Camille. Then, to her father, "Is Sophie with her?" "No," Cole said. "Go finish your show." Maddie disappeared back down the hall with the pragmatic acceptance of a child accustomed to adult conversation she wasn't part of. Cole gestured Camille toward the kitchen table, and they sat across from each other the way people sit when there's something specific to get through. "Tell me about the Tuesday," Camille said. "November 14th, Cole told her. Maddie had been running a fever since early evening, 102 by 7:30. He'd given her children's ibuprofen, made soup from a can because he'd run out of his usual stock and the grocery store was a problem when Maddie couldn't be left alone, and he'd spent most of the night on the couch outside her room in case she needed him. He hadn't left the apartment after 5:15 when he'd picked her up from after school. "Can anyone confirm that?" Camille asked. He thought for a moment. "I texted my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, around 8 to see if she had any children's Tylenol because I wasn't sure the ibuprofen was enough. She brought some over. She was at the door for maybe 10 minutes. That's enough," Camille said. Cole looked at her steadily. "You believe me?" Wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. "Before or after you verified?" "Before," she said, and meant it. "I'm verifying because my investigator needs documentation, not because I'm deciding based on it." Something in Cole's expression shifted, not dramatically, not the relief of a man who'd been holding his breath, more like the slight adjustment of someone who had been prepared for a harder conversation and found it going differently. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. "I know how this looks," he said. "I know what Preston Vale wants." "What do you think he wants?" "Two things," Cole said, without hesitation. "He wants me gone because I'm a liability to whatever image he thinks Westbrook Industries needs. And he wants the investigation focused on me, so it doesn't land anywhere near him." Camille looked at him. "Why would it land near him?" Cole met her eyes. "I don't know specifics, but in 14 months of working nights in that building, I've noticed things that weren't my business to notice. And I've been careful not to notice them." He paused. "The wrong people being in the wrong offices at the wrong times. Document couriers who weren't on any authorized list. Preston Vale in the building at 11 p.m. on nights when there was no board event scheduled." He paused again. "I didn't think much of it individually. Executives keep odd hours. But when I started adding them up in my head last night, after the call from HR, "You put them in order," Camille said. "The way I used to put things in order," he said. "Old habit." She looked at him across the kitchen table and thought about the personnel file with its thin employment history and its single line of prior government service and the way he'd heard her coming down the hallway at Westbrook Tower before she'd expected him to. "What did you do before building services?" she asked. The question had been waiting since the night in the hallway, and they both knew it. Cole looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked back at Camille. "Navy," he said. "Special operations. 12 years. "SEAL?" "Yes." Camille absorbed this without displaying the full weight of what it rearranged. "And you left." "When my wife left," he said. The words were flat, not bitter, the flatness of something processed long ago. Maddie was 2. She needed one parent who was actually present. He looked toward the hallway where the cartoon sound was still drifting out. "I wasn't going to let it be neither of us." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Cole," Camille said, "I have an investigator coming in this afternoon. I need you to be available to her. Everything you just told me, the nights, The couriers, Preston's presence in the building, all of it. Can you do that? Yes, he said, without qualifying it. And I need you to stay away from the building until this is resolved. Not because I think you're guilty. Because if you're anywhere near the investigation while it's active, Preston will use it. Cole nodded once, the nod of a man who understood tactical patience. What about Maddie's Saturday? Camille blinked. It took her a half-second to catch up to what he was asking. Sophie's Saturday. They made plans, he said, with a look that suggested Maddie had been specific about the consequences if those plans fell through. Saturday is still Saturday, Camille said. Bring her at 10. Cole almost smiled. Not quite. Okay. Diane Cho arrived at Westbrook Tower at 2 in the afternoon with a team of 3, a digital forensics specialist, a former federal agent who now handled document authentication, and her own associate counsel. Camille had given them complete access, overriding Preston's objection with a calmness that she suspected alarmed him more than anger would have. Preston had objected in the measured tone of a man who believed his position still meant something. An outside investigation at this stage sends a signal to the board that we don't have confidence in our own processes. I don't have confidence in our own processes, Camille said. That's why there's an outside investigation. She left him in the hallway and went to meet Diane. The forensics team went to work on the server logs and access records. Diane started with the security footage, which covered the executive floor's 2 main entry points and the server room corridor. What she found in the first 2 hours was what Rita Huang had already noticed and been too cautious to name directly. The footage for the 11 to midnight window on November 14th had a gap. Not a large gap. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, beginning at 11:44. It was the kind of gap that happened when someone who knew the system, who understood which server handled the redundant backup and at what interval the loop refreshed, wanted 4 minutes of invisibility. This wasn't improvised, Diane said, showing Camille the timestamp anomaly on her laptop screen in the empty conference room they'd commandeered. Someone planned this. They knew the camera system, they knew the access credential structure, and they knew which documents were where on that server. How many people have that level of system knowledge? Building IT would know the cameras. Executive floor access would know the documents. The overlap of both. Diane tapped the table. That's a short list. And Cole Barrett is not on it, Camille said. Cole Barrett couldn't even get to the executive floor without being logged. His building services credentials cap out at floor 12. The executive suite starts at 14. Diane closed the laptop. Whoever did this used his identity precisely because it would be easy to believe and hard for him to disprove. A janitor with no obvious record and a thin employment history. It's a clean scapegoat. Camille thought about Cole sitting across from her at his kitchen table, looking at his coffee cup, saying, I know how this looks. Keep going, she said. I want everything. The document authentication specialist spent the remainder of the afternoon on the email records. The message sent from Cole's account to the external address, a generic encrypted mail service, had originated from a device that was not assigned to building services. The device fingerprint matched a class of corporate laptops issued to executive floor personnel. Cross-referencing the device ID against the asset inventory took until early evening, and when the specialist came into the conference room to report, she put a printout on the table in front of Diane without saying anything first. Diane looked at it and then looked at Camille. The laptop was assigned to Kenneth Hale, Preston Vale's executive assistant. Camille read the name twice. She thought about the evenings Rita had seen Preston Vale in the building past 10, the couriers Cole had noticed who weren't on authorized lists, the quality of Preston's objection to the outside investigation. Not the objection of a man protecting institutional process, she understood now, but the objection of a man protecting himself. Find the maintenance access record, she said. Diane looked up. Sorry? Cole told me he'd noticed a pattern. Couriers, late-night visits from Preston. If Hale was the one who physically accessed the server room and planted the credentials, she stopped. The server room corridor requires a physical maintenance badge swipe, as well as the digital credential. Even if someone spoofed Cole's digital access, the physical badge has a separate log. Diane was already reaching for her phone to call the forensics specialist. The physical badge record took 30 minutes to retrieve from the building's separate mechanical access system, which ran on older hardware and was logged by a different company than the digital security system. That separation was intentional. It was a redundancy Camille had insisted on during a building security upgrade 2 years prior because she'd read a case study about credential fraud. She had never expected it to matter in her own building. Kenneth Hale's Maintenance Override Badge, issued for a plumbing emergency 6 months ago and apparently never returned to building operations, had been swiped at the server room corridor door at 11:46 on November 14th. 1 minute before Cole Barrett's credentials appeared in the digital log. Diane sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. "There it is," she said quietly. Camille looked at the printout. She felt a specific and familiar coldness, not anger yet. Anger came later, but the cold of someone who has confirmed something they'd hoped they were wrong about. "Now I need to know what Hale was sending and to whom," she said. That answer came the following morning. The external encrypted address that had received the confidential documents was traced through Diane's federal contacts who owed her favors she'd been saving for appropriate moments to a shell company registered in Delaware. That company had a financial relationship, ownership interests, dividend structures obscured through two intermediate entities, with a fund manager whose acquisition positioning in Hartwell Consolidated Sector had shifted significantly in the past 6 weeks. The fund manager was a former business associate of Preston Vale's from a period 20 years ago that predated his Westbrook Industries appointment. Camille received this information in a summary document Diane handed her across the conference room table at 8 in the morning, and she read it twice the way she read everything consequential, once for the facts and once for what the facts meant. What they meant was that Preston Vale had been engineering a position to profit from the Hartwell acquisition before it closed. He'd needed the financial projections, specifically the valuation models that would allow someone to calculate Westbrook Industries' maximum offer. And he'd needed a way to get them out of the building that wouldn't point at him. Cole Barrett had been selected not randomly, but specifically. A man with a thin documented history, a low-status job title, and a personal connection to Camille that Preston had clearly decided made him an embarrassment she'd be motivated to distance herself from. Preston had bet that Camille would want it handled quietly and quickly. He had bet that she'd take the clean exit, terminate the janitor, close the file, protect the deal's momentum. He had spent 20 years watching people make that calculation and had gotten very good at knowing when to offer it. He had, Camille thought, badly misread her. She called a board meeting for the following Monday. She sent the notice through the standard channels, giving nothing of the agenda away. She spent the weekend with Sophie and Maddie in the mansion while Cole did his Saturday drop-off and pickup, and on Saturday afternoon she sat on the garden terrace while the two girls did something complicated with a piece of rope and a wind chime that Sophie had taken down from the trellis, and she let herself be entirely present in that hour in a way she hadn't managed in weeks. Cole came at 4. He came to the terrace instead of ringing the front bell, which he'd started doing without discussion, and he leaned against the doorframe and watched Maddie try to explain something to Sophie with her hands, which was a communication method of very limited usefulness that Maddie deployed enthusiastically anyway. "How's the investigation?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Resolved," Camille said. He looked at her. That was fast. The evidence was there, it just needed someone to look at it without a predetermined destination. She paused. "Your observations were helpful. The late nights, the couriers. It gave Diane a starting point." Cole was quiet for a moment. Maddie had given up on her hand explanation and was now apparently demonstrating whatever she meant by doing it physically, which involved a degree of athleticism the activity hadn't obviously required. Sophie stood with her head tilted, tracking the rope sounds. "Is it enough?" Cole asked. "For the board?" "Yes." Camille looked at him. "For the legal exposure Preston has, that's going to take longer, but he won't be in that building after Monday." Cole nodded slowly. "What about the acquisition?" "It proceeds. The documentation Preston's associate received was from the preliminary valuation round, not the final offer model. They got less than they needed to be certain." She paused. "We'll adjust the final figures as a precaution and close on revised terms." "Smart," Cole said. "It's what Marcus would have done," she said, and then was surprised she'd said it, because she didn't usually invoke Marcus outside of her own thinking. Cole didn't ask who Marcus was. He had probably figured it out, or maybe he simply understood instinctively that some names don't require explanation. The board meeting Monday morning was the kind of morning that Camille would remember in specific detail for years afterward, Not because it was dramatic in the way movies render drama, raised voices, broken things, but because it was almost entirely quiet. The drama was in the sequence, in the careful laying out of fact after fact, in the particular silence that fell in the room as the sequence became undeniable. Preston Vale sat at his customary position at the table and watched the evidence assembled in front of him with an expression that traveled from composed to controlled to something behind the eyes that Camille recognized as the look of a man who has reached the end of his maneuvering room and knows it. Diane presented. Camille led her because a third party presenting evidence was more credible than a CEO presenting evidence about the man who'd tried to set up her janitor. Diane went through the access logs, the badge record, the device fingerprinting, the shell company structure, the financial positioning, the 20-year-old business relationship. She did it without editorial comment, each piece connecting to the next in a chain that left no reasonable gap. When Diane finished, the room was silent for a full 7 seconds. Camille counted. Jonathan Reeve, who was on the board and who Camille had always found genuinely decent even when she'd been evaluating him for other purposes, said, "Preston, do you want to respond?" Preston said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to speak with legal counsel before—" "Of course," Camille said. "The board will vote on suspension pending investigation in the meantime. All in favor?" Every hand went up, including, after a brief pause, 2 of Preston's longest allies on the board. That was how it worked when the evidence was complete enough. Loyalty had limits that documentation exceeded. Preston Vale left the building that afternoon. Security accompanied him to his office to collect personal items, which was protocol, and which Camille did not enjoy ordering but did not flinch from either. She stood in the hallway outside the boardroom after everyone had filed out and thought about 14 months, about a man who cleaned offices at night, and had said nothing about the things he'd noticed because they hadn't been his business, and he'd understood that. She called Cole. He picked up on the 3rd ring. She could hear Maddie in the background, something about a show she wanted to watch. "It's done," Camille said. "Preston's been suspended. The board vote was unanimous." A pause. "Okay," Cole said. "Your access will be reinstated today. HR will send you formal documentation clearing the record." "Okay," he said again. Camille waited, and when nothing else came, she said, "That's all you have to say?" "What else is there to say?" "Most people would say more," she said. "Most people weren't me," he said simply. "I knew what happened. Whether other people knew it or not wasn't going to change what I knew." She stood in the hallway and felt something she couldn't fully name. Respect, certainly, but something past respect. Something closer to the feeling of recognizing a kind of person you had stopped believing existed in the specific form they were standing in front of you. "Cole," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad Sophie found you in that hallway." A beat. "Me too," he said. She hung up and walked back toward the boardroom, where the cleanup of Preston Vale's 20 years of careful positioning was already beginning. It would take months. There would be outside counsel, regulatory disclosures, restructured relationships. There would be uncomfortable conversations with investors who would want reassurance that the company's governance hadn't been compromised at its core. Camille would handle all of it. She had handled harder things. But as she sat back down at the head of the table and the remaining board members gathered their papers and their questions, something reached her from the other side of the building's windows. The low sound of the city going about its ordinary business, traffic and wind, and a siren somewhere far off. And she thought about a man in a utility cart pushing down a hallway, humming something tuneless, noticing everything he was never supposed to notice, and saying nothing because it wasn't his place. And she thought about how, in her experience, that was the specific quality that separated people who were genuinely trustworthy from people who had simply never been tested. Cole Barrett had been tested long before she'd known his name. He'd been tested in ways she still didn't have the full picture of, in places she'd never been, carrying weight she hadn't asked about. And he'd come out of it wearing a maintenance uniform and raising his daughter in an apartment across town, modeling aircraft on a coffee table, letting an 8-year-old throw a backpack at him as a greeting. The news that Cole Barrett was a former Navy SEAL reached the board members by end-of-day Monday. Camille hadn't released it. It had come through Diane's background check documentation, which was shared with the board as part of the full investigation record. By Tuesday morning, 3 of the same executives who had walked past Cole in the hallway for 14 months without making eye contact were sending Camille messages asking whether they'd had any idea. She had not for most of it she told them honestly. But her daughter had. That part she kept short when she said it, because it was the part that was not really about the board, not really about governance or optics or institutional confidence. It was about a 9-year-old girl who had sat in a room full of accomplished, carefully selected men and found them all insufficient in ways she couldn't see and somehow still knew. On Tuesday evening, Camille drove to Cole's apartment building and sat in her car for a few minutes before going up. She had something to say that she wanted to say correctly, which meant she needed a moment to find the right form for it. She went up and knocked. Cole answered, this time without the sweatshirt. He'd come from somewhere, still had his jacket on, keys in his hand, clearly just arrived. I have something to offer you, Camille said. Not tonight, not formally, but I want you to think about it. He waited. There's a role at Westbrook Industries that I've been trying to fill for 2 years, she said. Head of Corporate Security and Crisis Management. The person who's going to do it well needs to understand operational planning, threat assessment, how organizations fail from the inside. They need to know what it looks like when someone's running a scheme inside the building they're supposed to be protecting. Cole looked at her without speaking. You noticed everything Preston was doing, she said. 14 months of night shifts, and you had a more accurate picture of what was happening on that executive floor than anyone sitting on the board. I wasn't doing the job, he said. I was just paying attention. That's the job, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, Maddie's show was playing from the other room. The model on the coffee table was further along than it had been on Sunday. She could see it past his shoulder, the fuselage taking shape. I'm not interested in charity, he said finally. I know that, she said. I'm not offering it. I'm offering a position that needs to be filled by someone who actually has the qualifications, and you have them. Your prior service, your training, your 14 months of operational observation inside this specific building. She stopped. Cole, I'm not doing this because Sophie chose you. I'm doing this because you are the right person for the role. He looked at her steadily. I'd want to earn every step after, he said. No, obviously, she said, cutting him off without heat. I'd be insulted if you wanted anything else. He almost laughed. Not quite. Something in his face that was close to it. Let me think about it, he said. Take the time you need, Camille said. She went back down to her car and drove home through the cold city, and she thought about how the evening of the gathering, the dinner she had organized so carefully, the 5 men she had vetted so thoroughly, had led here, to a conversation in an apartment doorway about a role that actually fit someone, and how the path between those 2 points had run straight through a 9-year-old girl's arms around a janitor's waist in a marble hallway. Sophie was asleep when Camille got home. She looked in on her anyway, the way she always did. Sophie in her bed, cane on the nightstand, one hand curled under her chin, entirely peaceful in the way she was only ever peaceful when she was asleep and didn't have to work at orienting herself. Camille stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about what it cost Sophie every day, and what Sophie had built out of that cost, and what her daughter had seen in Cole Barrett with no eyes at all. Then she turned off the light and went to bed, and for the first time in a very long while, she slept without reviewing what she should have done differently. Cole called 3 days later. Camille was in a meeting when the call came in, a preliminary debrief with the Hartwell Consolidated legal team about revised acquisition terms, and she excused herself from the conference room in a way that was not entirely characteristic of her, stepping into the hallway and answering before she'd fully thought about why she was prioritizing this particular call over a room full of attorneys billing by the hour. I'll take the role, Cole said. No preamble, no performance of having deliberated at length. Okay, Camille said. I want to talk through the structure before anything's formalized. Scope, authority, reporting line. I'm not walking into something undefined. I'd expect nothing less, she said. Thursday morning, my office, 8 o'clock. Works for me. A pause. One more thing. Go ahead. Maddie wants to know if Sophie's Saturday is still on, even though things are different now. Her word. Camille leaned against the hallway wall. Through the conference room glass, she could see 3 attorneys looking at their phones with the restless energy of expensive people who resented waiting. Tell Maddie that things being different is not a reason to cancel Saturday. That's what I told her, Cole said. She wanted it confirmed by primary source. 8 years old and she's demanding source verification, Camille said. She gets it from somewhere, Cole said. And that time there was something in his voice that was unmistakably a smile, even without the visual evidence. Thursday, 8 o'clock. He hung up. Camille stood in the hallway for another 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than necessary, then went back into the conference room and resumed the meeting with the unruffled focus she was known for. And nobody in that room had any idea that she'd just had a conversation that mattered to her considerably more than the one she'd stepped away from. The Thursday meeting lasted 2 hours and went nothing like Camille had initially structured it. She had prepared a formal position outline, scope of responsibilities, authority parameters, compensation package, reporting hierarchy, with the thoroughness she applied to every significant personnel appointment. Cole arrived at 8 with a legal pad, which she found unexpectedly charming only because it was so completely at odds with what she'd expected. And he worked through her outline question by question in a way that was not adversarial but was very direct. And he crossed out 2 things, added 1, and flagged a reporting structure issue that Camille's own HR director had not flagged in the initial document review. "If I'm reporting to the CFO on budget matters and to you on operational decisions," Cole said, tapping the relevant section with his pen, "and those 2 ever conflict, which they will, because they always do, I need a clear protocol for escalation. Right now, this document doesn't have one. That means whoever yells loudest wins, and that's not a security structure, that's just noise management." Camille looked at the document. He was right. "Add your preferred escalation protocol," she said, sliding the legal pad toward him. He wrote for about 90 seconds, handed it back. She read it, and it was cleaner than what her HR director would have written because it was specific without being bureaucratic, which was a harder thing to achieve than most people realized. "Agreed," she said. Cole put the cap back on his pen. "When do I start?" 2 weeks, if that's enough time to arrange Maddie's schedule." Something moved briefly across his face, the look of a single parent doing rapid mental calculations that had nothing to do with the meeting. "Should be fine. Mrs. Patel does afternoons sometimes." "There's also an option, if it would be useful," Camille said carefully, "to arrange pickup and after-school coverage through the household staff on days when your schedule runs late. I have a driver and a household coordinator. Sophie would be there anyway. It wouldn't be—" "Let me think about that," Cole said. Not a refusal, not an acceptance. The considered pause of a man who was very precise about which forms of help he was willing to accept and why, Camille said. He started 2 weeks later, and what followed was a period of institutional reconstruction that was unglamorous, methodical, and entirely necessary. The Preston Vale fallout had exposed not just one man's scheme, but the structural weaknesses that had allowed it to remain undetected for the better part of a year. Camille had known, in an abstract way, that a company her size carried operational blind spots. Every company did. What she had not appreciated was how specifically Preston had mapped and exploited them, how precisely he had understood which oversight mechanisms had gaps and which personnel had enough autonomy to go unmonitored. Cole understood this too, but from the opposite direction. He had spent 14 months as invisible infrastructure, one of the people a building's daily operations depended on, and whose presence nobody at the executive level registered. He had seen the building the way water sees a landscape, finding every low point, every crack, every place where things ran downhill without anyone having designed it that way. The security division he began building was shaped by that knowledge in ways that a conventional security consultant would not have arrived at, because a conventional security consultant would have started from the executive floor down. Cole started from the maintenance corridors up. Within 6 weeks, he had identified 3 additional access vulnerabilities that the building's existing security firm had not flagged in 2 years of contracted audits. He documented them without drama and presented them to Camille in a 1-page memo that ended with proposed solutions and estimated implementation costs. She read it once, approved everything, and forwarded it to IT and facilities with a note that said, "Execute this as written." The board, which had been watching Cole Barrett's transition with the particular wariness of institutional bodies absorbing something they hadn't anticipated, began shifting. Not dramatically. Boards didn't do anything dramatically unless they had to, but in the accumulative way of people reassessing a situation whose facts had changed. The executive who had walked past Cole in the hallway without acknowledgement for over a year now held the door for him in the lobby. 2 others had sent Camille private notes saying variations of the same thing, that they were impressed, that they thought the appointment was the right call, that they hadn't expected. Camille read these notes and filed them, and did not reply with what she was thinking, which was that the gap between what they'd expected and what Cole actually was had existed for 14 months, and none of them had noticed. And that perhaps the more relevant question was what else they were failing to notice about the people who kept their building running while they were busy being impressed by each other. She mentioned this once, obliquely, to Cole, on an evening when they were both still in the building past 7, and had ended up in the small kitchen adjacent to the executive floor with the collective intentionality of two people who had been moving toward the same space without coordinating it. "The board is recalibrating," she said, pouring coffee that had been sitting too long and would be bad, which she didn't care about. "I noticed," Cole said. He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, the easy stance of a man who was comfortable not having anywhere urgent to be. "Reeve held the elevator for me this morning. Did he?" Stood there holding the button with a look on his face like he was making a significant gesture. Cole's mouth moved. "I told him I'd catch the next one. He seemed confused by that." Camille laughed. The real kind, the kind that surprised her slightly. "You understand you're going to have to let them recalibrate, whether it's earned or not." "Oh, it's not about whether it's earned," Cole said. "I just don't need it. There's a difference." He picked up his own coffee cup. "The people whose opinion of me I care about haven't changed. That's the list I'm working off." She looked at him across the kitchen. The light in there was institutional. Overhead fluorescence, slightly harsh. The kind of light that showed the actual state of a person rather than the aspirational version. Cole looked tired in a functional way. The tiredness of someone who had put in a full day and would put in another tomorrow without requiring acknowledgement of the effort. His jacket was over a chair somewhere. He had the sleeves of his shirt pushed up. "Who's on that list?" she asked. He considered this with the slight pause of someone who was not performing consideration but actually doing it. "Maddie, Sophie, Mrs. Patel." He paused again. "You." The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. "That's a short list," Camille said. "Short lists are easier to protect," he said. She drank her bad coffee and thought about that, and they stood in the kitchen for another few minutes talking about something else. The Hartwell integration timeline, a facilities issue on the 9th floor. And then Cole left to collect Maddie from Mrs. Patel's, and Camille stood alone in the kitchen for a moment after he'd gone and noticed that the room felt different when he wasn't in it. And then she went back to her desk and did not examine that observation too carefully because the timing was not right, and she knew the timing was not right. It was Sophie who made the timing irrelevant. Not by saying anything particularly profound, and not by doing anything particularly deliberate. Sophie was 9, and 9-year-olds were not subtle in ways that could be mistaken for something else. One Saturday morning in late February, while Maddie was in the kitchen demonstrating some kind of pancake construction technique that required 3 mixing bowls and an optimism about cleanup that was entirely unfounded, Sophie came and found Camille in the sitting room where she was reviewing a document she was supposed to be reviewing, and Sophie sat next to her on the couch, in the way she did when she had something to say and was trying to find the right approach to it. Camille set the document down. Sophie ran her fingers along the edge of the couch cushion for a moment. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay. And I want you to answer honestly, even if you think I won't understand the answer." "I always answer you honestly," Camille said, which was true, except for the specific category of adult things she'd always judged Sophie not ready for. And she suspected Sophie knew about that category, even if she'd never named it. "Are you going to keep looking for a husband?" Sophie said. "Like before?" Camille was quiet for a moment. The question was stated very simply and was not simple at all. "I stopped," she said, "after the dinner. I realized I'd been going about it wrong." Sophie absorbed this. Her fingers stilled on the cushion. What was wrong about it? "I was looking at credentials," Camille said. "What someone had done, what they owned, what other people thought of them." She paused. "I forgot that those things aren't the same as who someone is." Sophie nodded slowly. "Cole doesn't own things," she said. "No," Camille said. "Not many." "But he's different," Sophie said. "When he's in a room, the room is different." She said this with the certainty of someone reporting an observable fact rather than offering an opinion. "The air is different. Everything orients." Camille looked at her daughter's face, the particular stillness of it, the inward quality of her attention, and thought about all the things Sophie perceived that she never had vocabulary for because the vocabulary most people used for perception was visual. You feel that, Camille said. Everybody feels it, Sophie said, with a slight edge of impatience that was very specifically 9 years old. You just look at other things instead of feeling it, she paused. Most people do. They look at what the person's wearing, or what car they got out of, or how tall they are. Another pause. I think that's probably a big disadvantage. I think you might be right, Camille said. Sophie seemed satisfied with this. She moved slightly on the couch cushion, settling in. The men from the dinner, she said. You know why none of them worked. Tell me, Camille said, because Sophie would have reasons and they would be specific. Sophie organized her thoughts for a moment. The doctor brought me a music box because he'd read that blind children like music. He didn't ask me. He researched. She said the word with a small but precise weight on it. When people research you instead of asking you, they're not actually interested in you. They're interested in their idea of you. Camille said nothing. She did not want to interrupt the catalog. The hotel man talked about his hotel like it was a person, Sophie continued, like he needed me to love it. That's... She searched for the word. Needy. In the wrong direction. He wanted Sophie Westbrook to like him. He wasn't thinking about whether he liked Sophie Westbrook. And Jonathan Reeve? He's nice, Sophie said, with a fairness that was almost judicial. He asked me what I think about before I sleep. That was good. But then he got careful when you walked. His voice changed. She tilted her head slightly. Not his words. His voice. The pitch. The speed. He started performing. She said this word with a precision that suggested she'd been carrying it for a while. Cole doesn't perform. He's the same in every room. Same speed, same pitch, same everything. Camille sat with that for a moment. You hear all of that. Everybody hears all of that, Sophie said again. They just don't listen. From the kitchen came the sound of something hitting the floor. Ceramic, by the sound of it, not breaking, just landing. And Maddie's voice announcing that it was fine, it was completely fine, nobody needed to come in. Sophie's mouth curved. I should go help, Sophie said, which almost certainly meant she was going to go provide running commentary rather than practical assistance. But Camille let her go. She sat alone in the sitting room for a while after Sophie disappeared down the hall, holding the unreviewed document and not reviewing it. 3 days later, she called Graham Whitfield. He was the only one of the 5 she felt she owed a direct conversation to, Jonathan Reeve. She had seen enough of Socially that the message had been clear, and the others had faded without requiring explanation. But Graham she called, because Graham had been genuinely decent, had asked Sophie the right questions, had not performed, and deserved to hear from her directly rather than through polite distance. He took it well, because Graham Whitfield was the kind of man who had been around long enough to know that graceful acceptance was both more dignified and more useful than the alternative. You found someone, he said. It was not quite a question. It's more complicated than that, Camille said. It usually is, Graham said. Is he good to Sophie? Sophie picked him, Camille said. A pause, and then Graham Whitfield laughed. The real kind, the warm kind of a man who found the universe occasionally satisfying. Then I think you've done better than a dinner party could have managed, he said. I think so too, Camille said. She thanked him and meant it, and that was the last conversation about the 5 men she had organized and carefully screened, all of whom had been insufficient in ways that had nothing to do with their professional accomplishments and everything to do with the specific question Sophie had been answering all along, which was not, who is the most qualified, but who is already behaving like someone who belongs here? The question of what exactly Camille and Cole were to each other during this period was one neither of them was answering out loud, which was a mutual and somewhat deliberate arrangement. They were professional colleagues. They were in each other's lives in the specific way of 2 people whose children had formed a bond that organized their schedules. They stood in kitchens past 7 in the evenings, having conversations that were partially about work and partially not, and they drove separately to the same places and arrived within minutes of each other with the coordination of people who had been doing that longer than they had. And neither of them named any of this because they were both, in their different ways, people who understood the cost of getting something significant wrong. Cole understood it from the specific experience of watching something valuable come apart, his marriage, his former life. and learning that you did not rebuild trust in others before you'd rebuilt confidence in your own judgment. Camille understood it from a different angle. She was a woman who controlled most things and knew what it felt like when something was moving under its own power rather than being steered. And this was moving under its own power, and she was trying to respect that rather than direct it. Sophie, who understood none of the subtext and all of the essential fact, was simply impatient. She expressed this impatience not through direct statement. She had learned from Camille that direct statement in adult matters was often counterproductive, but through a series of maneuvers that were so transparently transparent that they would have been obvious to anyone not actively choosing not to see them. She arranged for herself and Maddie to need things from other floors of the mansion at convenient moments. She reported to Cole on Saturday afternoons detailed summaries of things Camille had said during the week that were not the kinds of things one shared with a coworker. She asked Cole, in Camille's presence, questions about what his apartment needed that a bigger space might provide, which was a 9-year-old's version of a real estate argument and not a subtle one. Maddie, who was 8 and less diplomatic, simply said to Camille directly one Saturday, "My dad looks at you the way he looks at the model when it's going really well, like he doesn't want to mess it up." Camille had not known what to do with this, so she had said, "That's very observant, Maddie." And Maddie had said, "I know," and gone back to whatever she was doing. Cole found out about this comment 3 days later because Camille told him, because she had reached the point where not telling him felt like more of a decision than telling him. They were standing in the Westbrook Tower parking garage, having finished a security walkthrough of the building's loading dock access points, and the garage was empty except for their cars and the fluorescent hum of the overhead lights. And Camille told him what Maddie had said. Cole was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "She doesn't have a filter." "Don't apologize for it," Camille said. "She's not wrong." Another silence. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the building above them, an elevator arrived at a floor with a faint bell sound. "No," Cole said finally. "She's not wrong." Camille looked at him. "We're careful people," she said. "Both of us." "Yeah. And I think being careful is right." She paused. "I think the timing has to be right. Sophie and Maddie need to be—" "I know," he said. "I'm not pushing." "I know you're not," she said. "I just want you to know that it's not—" She stopped and started again. "I'm not being careful because I'm uncertain. I'm being careful because some things you only get to do correctly once, and this is one of them." Cole looked at her for a long moment with the steady quality of attention that she had first noticed in the hallway 8 months ago, the look of a man who was not deciding what to say next, but actually listening to what he'd just heard. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They went to their separate cars and drove separately home, and that was the right thing, and they both knew it. And it was still, underneath the rightness, one of the harder things either of them had done in recent memory. What followed was 6 weeks of a kind of deliberate ordinariness that was not ordinary at all. They continued working together, which meant they saw each other daily, which meant they had developed the specific unconscious fluency of people who had been in each other's professional space long enough to anticipate each other's movements. Camille would turn to say something, and Cole was already looking. Cole would reach for a document in a meeting, and it was already where he'd expected it to be because Camille had put it there. The board noticed. Boards noticed everything eventually, even the things that weren't their business, because sustained proximity to power made people observant in self-interested ways. Jonathan Reeves said nothing. 2 of the female board members said something to each other that Camille became aware of secondhand and chose to ignore because the alternative was addressing it directly, which would have given it more weight than it warranted. What mattered in those 6 weeks was what was happening in the mansion on weekends and weekday evenings. When Camille's schedule ran late enough that Cole's Maddie coverage arrangement with the household coordinator came into effect, and Cole came to collect her, and the 4 of them would end up at the kitchen table for 15 minutes, that reliably became 45, which reliably became dinner because someone was hungry, and it was the most practical solution. They were not a family yet. They were something adjacent to it, something that had the texture of family in specific moments, the noise and the minor irritations and the easy silences, and then dispersed back into 2 separate households and 2 separate lives. But the dispersal felt increasingly like an inconvenience of logistics rather than a natural state. Sophie felt this and said so, with the directness she'd inherited from her mother and the precision she'd developed on her own. One evening, when Cole and Maddie had gone home, and Camille was sitting on the edge of Sophie's bed for the nightly debrief that had been their ritual since Sophie was 4. Sophie said, "The house is quieter when they leave." "I know," Camille said. "I don't like it," Sophie said. "The quiet. Not this kind." Camille smoothed the blanket. "What kind is it?" "The kind that means something's missing," Sophie said. "Not the kind that means everything's okay." Camille sat with that for a moment, her hand on the blanket, the room dim with the nightlight Sophie still kept, because even with no functional vision, she had told Camille once, a little light made the dark feel less like a wall. "I'm working on it," Camille said. "I know," Sophie said. Then quietly, "Don't work too slowly." Camille turned off the light on the way out and stood in the hallway, and did not feel rushed exactly. She felt the opposite of rushed. She felt the particular steadiness of someone who has looked at where they are and where they're going and found the two things aligned, finally, after a long period of looking at a map that didn't match the terrain. She went downstairs and called Cole. He picked up on the second ring. "Maddie get home okay?" she said. "She fell asleep in the car," he said. "Carried her in. She didn't wake up, which means the pancake mission of this morning finally caught up with her." "How many did she eat?" "I stopped counting at 4, he said. "Parental survival mechanism." Camille sat in her kitchen in the quiet house and smiled at the wall. "Cole." "Yeah." I think we should stop being so careful," she said. A beat. "Just to be clear," he said, "you're saying stop being careful, like whatever this is should just be what it is," she said, "without a timeline, without managing it." Another beat. The careful man on the other end of the phone, the man who had spent a year and a half being invisible and had been seen anyway by a 9-year-old with a cane and a certainty that never wavered. "Yeah," Cole said. "Okay." "Okay," she said. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing specific. Maddie's upcoming school project, a facilities issue on the 14th floor that needed addressing, whether Sophie had mentioned to Cole that she was learning to identify bird species by sound, which she had not mentioned to Camille until that afternoon, and which had apparently been a project she and Maddie had been developing independently for 3 weeks, using a library audiobook neither adult had known about. When Camille finally hung up and sat in the silence of the kitchen, she thought about the night of the gathering, 11 months ago, when she had sat in this same kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold and tried to make sense of what Sophie had done. She had written in her notes, "Sophie chose him. Find out why." She understood now. She had been understanding for a while, incrementally, the way you understand something that is true and patient, something that will wait for you to catch up to it. Sophie had not chosen Cole because he was a SEAL, or because he would turn out to have been right about Preston Vale, or because his credentials would eventually impress a boardroom full of people who hadn't bothered to learn his name. Sophie had chosen Cole because the first time she lost her bearings in an unfamiliar building, in the dark, without a map, he had crouched 4 feet away and asked her what she could hear. Not what she needed, not what she was afraid of, what she could hear. And that question, the one that assumed she had resources rather than deficits, that started from capability rather than limitation, was the question of a person who already understood something most people spent their whole lives missing. Camille sat in the kitchen until almost midnight, not reviewing documents, not organizing anything, not preparing for what came next, just sitting in a house that was quiet in the wrong way tonight, but would not always be. The thing about stopping being careful, Camille discovered, was that it didn't feel like stopping at all. It felt more like exhaling, the specific relief of a breath held too long, released not dramatically, but simply because the body had reached its limit and the air had to go somewhere. Nothing collapsed, nothing rushed in to fill the space. Life continued in its ordinary textures, and the only thing that changed was the quality of her presence inside it. She stopped editing herself around Cole. That was the first thing. She stopped the half-second delay she'd been inserting between what she thought and what she said. The small professional buffer she'd maintained since the kitchen conversation in December, when she'd first noticed the room feeling different without him in it. She stopped managing the momentum of what was happening between them the way she managed everything else, with strategy, with timeline, with contingency plans for contingency plans. And she let it move at whatever speed it actually moved. It moved, it turned out, at the speed of 2 people with too much to do and not enough hours, which was not a romantic speed by any conventional measure, but was, for them, exactly right. Cole took her to dinner twice in January, and both times it was at places that were neither impressive nor unimpressive, simply good. A Vietnamese restaurant in Midtown where the owner knew him by name, a steakhouse in Brooklyn that had been open since 1987 and smelled like it and was the better for it. He did not make reservations he couldn't afford or order wine he knew nothing about. He did not perform the version of himself he thought she might prefer. He showed up in a jacket that was clean but not new and asked her questions about things she actually cared about, and he listened to the answers in the way she had first noticed in the hallway. With his whole attention, not the nodding performance of attention, but the actual thing, where you could feel it. Camille had been on enough dinners in her adult life to understand the difference between a man who was listening and a man who was waiting for his turn to speak. Cole was, without exception or performance, the former. She told him about Marcus on the second dinner. Not the full history, not the reconstructed narrative she sometimes told herself to make sense of that period of her life, but the real things, the way he had laughed, the specific quality of his absence in the apartment after he died, the reading chair she had left behind because walking past it had felt like being punched in the same place every day. She told him that she had rebuilt the company partly because it needed to be rebuilt, and partly because it was the only container large enough to hold her grief without overflowing, which was not a thing she had said to anyone else in exactly those words. Cole listened. He didn't say it was brave. He didn't say Marcus sounded like a great man in the reflexive way people said things to fill the space that grief left. He said, "Sophie has his laugh." Camille looked up. "How would you know that?" "You have a photograph in your office," Cole said. "The one on the shelf behind your desk. He's laughing in it. I've spent enough time in that office to notice." He paused. "Sophie sounds like that when something actually lands. The real laugh." Camille sat with that for a moment, with the strange, specific comfort of someone who had been seen without asking to be. "She does," she said. "He'd have liked what she's become," Cole said. Not a consolation. An observation stated with the same matter-of-fact quality he used for everything, as if sentimentality and practical truth were not mutually exclusive. She reached across the table and touched his hand, briefly, the way you touch something you've been wanting to touch for a long time and finally have permission for. And then the waiter arrived with dessert menus and the moment dispersed into the ordinary business of the evening, and neither of them mentioned it again because neither of them needed to. March came in cold and stayed that way through the middle of the month, and the Hartwell acquisition closed on a Thursday afternoon after 7 months of negotiation, 2 restructured offer documents, and a regulatory review that had required Camille's legal team to produce documentation at a rate that had cost her 3 weekends and 1 entire night in the office. When the final signatures landed and the deal was formally complete, her general counsel came into her office and put a bottle of champagne on the desk that the legal team had clearly been holding in preparation. And Camille thanked everyone, accepted a glass, and sat alone in her office after the celebration had dispersed back to its individual desks. She thought about the deal, what it cost, what it meant, what Marcus would have said about the terms. He'd have wanted the integration timeline compressed. She knew that. He was always impatient with the space between acquisition and operational control. She thought about Preston Vale, who was at that moment somewhere in a legal process that would take another 18 months to resolve and would result in consequences that Diane Cho described as meaningful, and that Camille tried not to think about too much. Not because she lacked the appetite for justice, but because the appetite for justice had a way of becoming its own occupation if you weren't careful. She thought about the fact that the acquisition had nearly been compromised by a man who had looked at Cole Barrett in a maintenance uniform and seen a convenient tool. She thought about what that said about the specific blindness of people who organize the world according to visible indicators of value, titles, salaries, addresses, the cut of a jacket, and how completely that blindness had failed Preston Vale in the end, because the man he'd tried to use as a prop had turned out to be the person who'd helped dismantle him. There was something in that worth sitting with, something about the way we construct our hierarchies of worth, and then are repeatedly surprised when reality declines to honor them. Sophie had known it from the beginning, had known it with the unselfconscious certainty of a child who had never been able to use the shortcuts that sighted adults relied on, had never had the option of judging the cover before opening the book. Her limitation had become, without anyone planning it, her most accurate instrument. Camille thought about that for a long time in the quiet of her office, with the champagne she hadn't finished going flat in the glass. Then she picked up her phone and texted Cole. Deal closed. Coming home. Three dots appeared immediately. Then, Maddie made pasta. Come hungry. She laughed at her phone in an empty office and gathered her things and went home. The word home had shifted its location over the past several months in a way that was quiet enough that Camille hadn't entirely tracked it happening. The mansion had always been home in the technical sense. Her address, Sophie's address, the place where her things were, and her life was organized, and her daughter slept with a nightlight in a room full of books she read with her fingers. But home as a feeling, home as the specific gravity that pulled you toward a place at the end of a day, had begun to relocate itself toward wherever the four of them happened to be at any given moment, which was sometimes the mansion and sometimes Cole's apartment, and sometimes, increasingly, the space between, the drive over, the phone call on the way, the particular quality of arriving somewhere that already knew you were coming. The pasta was imperfect in the way that all meals cooked by people with actual lives were imperfect, slightly overcooked. The sauce from a jar that Maddie had augmented with things she'd found in the cabinet with an inventiveness that was brave if not always successful. Sophie had set the table, which she did now with the confidence of someone who had memorized the specific geography of every surface in the mansion's kitchen and applied that knowledge with an efficiency that still, sometimes, made Camille stop briefly and feel the full weight of her daughter's capability. They ate. Maddie talked about a school project on ecosystems with the velocity of a child who had done the research and was now its reluctant expert. Cole asked Sophie about the bird identification project, which had progressed to the point where Sophie could distinguish 17 species by call and was working on regional variants with a methodical enthusiasm that bore a notable resemblance to the way her mother approached due diligence. Sophie asked Cole a question about aircraft. She'd been listening to an audiobook about aviation history, another independent project nobody had assigned her, and Cole answered it with the specific knowledge of someone who had spent time near aircraft in operational contexts, and Sophie followed up with three more questions. And Camille sat at the table and ate the imperfect pasta and watched her daughter conduct an interview with the man who had crouched in a hallway and given her a map made of sound, and felt the full and uncomplicated weight of something being exactly right. Not perfect. Nothing about it was perfect. The pasta was genuinely overcooked. Maddie had knocked over a glass of water in the first 5 minutes, and the cleanup had been imperfect. Sophie had a disagreement with Cole about a point of aviation history that she was actually wrong about and did not fully concede even when presented with evidence. And Camille had a headache from the champagne she hadn't finished, and the 7 months of accumulated deal stress finally releasing all at once. It was in all these ways exactly right. Cole proposed in early April on the rooftop garden of Westbrook Tower, where Sophie had first learned to navigate by sound. He had asked Camille 3 weeks earlier if he could take the four of them up there on a Saturday evening, framing it as something Sophie had mentioned wanting to revisit now that spring was coming, and the wind would be different through the trellis panels on the roof than it had been the first time she'd mapped it. Camille had said yes, and had not asked additional questions, and had spent the following 3 weeks pretending she didn't know what was coming, while knowing, with the certainty of a woman who had spent considerable time studying Cole Barrett's patterns of behavior, exactly what was coming. It was not an elaborate proposal. Cole Barrett was not an elaborate man. He had not arranged anything that required advanced coordination or a team of people or a speech that had been workshopped into polish. He had brought the four of them to a rooftop in early April, with the city spread below them in the specific way it spread on clear spring evenings, vast and lit and indifferent in the way cities were, and beautiful despite that or because of it. And he had waited until Maddie and Sophie were at the trellis doing whatever they perpetually did at the trellis, and then he'd turned to Camille with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her in the direct way he looked at everything and said, "I want to ask you something." "I know," she said. He paused. "You know." "Cole, I've been watching you not prepare for this for 3 weeks." Something crossed his face that was equal parts exasperation and something warmer. "I wasn't that obvious." "You're many things," she said. "Subtle is not one of them." He pulled a hand from his pocket. The ring was simple. A single stone, pale and clear, in a plain setting that looked like it had been chosen by a man who understood quality without needing it to announce itself. He held it in the April air between them. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I know that too. And I know this is... He stopped. Tried again. I know what I am and what I'm not. I know what you have and what this would be asking. He looked at her steadily. I'm not offering you easy. I'm offering you real. Camille looked at the ring and then at his face, at the particular quality of him in that moment. Not performing, not arranging himself for her approval, just standing in the wind on a rooftop in his good jacket, being exactly and only who he was. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger and it fit the way it fit when someone has paid enough attention to know the right size without asking. And then Sophie appeared at her elbow, as if she had somehow known the moment had arrived despite the 15 feet of distance, which Camille did not entirely believe was coincidence. And Sophie reached out and found Camille's hand and felt the ring on it with her fingertips, and ran them over the stone and the setting with the focused attention she brought to every object that needed to be understood. And then she said, "It's the right size." It is, Camille said. Good, Sophie said, with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. She went back to Maddie at the trellis, and they heard Maddie say something that made Sophie laugh, and the sound of it went out over the rooftop and into the city air. Cole and Camille stood together in the wind and did not say anything for a moment because nothing needed to be said, and then Cole put his arm around her shoulders in the uncomplicated way of a man who had waited long enough for things to simply be what they were. And they watched the city below them going about the business of a Saturday evening in April, indifferent and lit and full of the ordinary noise of people living their lives. The wedding was in June, on a Saturday, at a house in upstate New York that Camille rented for a weekend because she had wanted something with a garden, and without marble floors, and without any association with business. 40 people, most of them actually known to both of them, rather than obligated by professional relationship. Mrs. Patel came and cried during the vows, without attempting to conceal it, which Camille found she loved. Rita Hong came and drank exactly 2 glasses of wine and gave a toast so dry and precise that half the room laughed, and the other half was still catching up when she sat down. Diane Cho came and was excellent company and left early because she had a case. Jonathan Reeve and Graham Whitfield were not invited, which was not a cruelty. They had both been told, through the appropriate channels, that Camille's circumstances had changed, and both had responded with the genuine good grace of men who were fundamentally decent and who had never been led to expect more than they'd been offered. Camille thought of both of them occasionally with a warmth that was uncomplicated by anything else, which was the best outcome anyone could have hoped for. Maddie was a flower girl in a dress she had selected herself, which was pale yellow and slightly too formal for the garden setting and completely right. Sophie stood beside Camille through the ceremony, close enough to feel the fabric of her dress against her arm. And when the official part was finished and the moment completed itself into whatever a completed moment was, Sophie reached out and found Cole's hand and held it. And that was the thing. Out of everything that happened that day, that was the thing Camille would carry forward into every year afterward. Sophie had chosen him first, and now she was choosing him again, with full knowledge, with time between the two choices and evidence accumulated, and a judgment more complete than the first one. And her judgment had not changed. It never had. They honeymooned for 5 days, with the girl staying with Mrs. Patel in an arrangement that Maddie described as a vacation and Sophie described as logistically sensible, and that was, in its way, both. Camille and Cole went to a house on the Maine coast that a college friend of Camille's had offered them, and they spent 5 days in a house that smelled like salt air and old wood, cooking badly and walking the coast and sleeping without alarms. And it was nothing like the romantic ideal of a honeymoon, and it was entirely sufficient. On the 3rd evening, they sat on the porch with the particular silence of the Maine coast at night, vast and salt dark, the sound of the water different from the city, slower and deeper and less interrupted. And Cole said, "I keep thinking about something." "What?" "All of it," he said, "the way it happened." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 14 months cleaning offices and nobody saw me. Not in the way that means anything. And then Sophie..." He stopped. "She saw you immediately," Camille said. "Yeah." He looked out at the water. "I've been in situations where my life depended on people not seeing me. 12 years of making myself invisible when necessary. And then this 9-year-old in a hallway just..." He made a small gesture with his hand that meant demolished all of that effortlessly. "She has a gift," Camille said. "It's not a gift," Cole said. "It's what happens when you can't use the easy reading. She had to go deeper because the surface wasn't available. He paused. Most people don't go deeper. The surface is usually enough and it's a lot less work. Camille thought about that. You think that's what we do? Read surfaces? I think we all do, he said. I did it too, for different reasons. Kept myself surface level in that building. Uniform, cart, clipboard. Let people see the category instead of the person. He looked at his hands. It was easier. Easier than explaining, easier than the questions that would come if I started being... He didn't finish the sentence. A person, Camille said. Something like that. The water moved in the dark below the porch. Do you regret it? She asked. The time you spent invisible. Cole considered this with genuine seriousness. No, he said, because Maddie needed me present in her life, and being visible in that particular building didn't have anything to do with being present for her. He paused again. I think I regret not the invisibility, more the idea that I thought it was what I deserved for a while there. He said this quietly, without drama, in the way you say things that have been examined enough that they no longer have sharp edges, but you want to be accurate about anyway. Camille looked at his profile. You were raising a child alone after your marriage ended. You weren't punishing yourself, you were managing. Those can be the same thing, he said. Yeah, she said. They can. They sat with that for a while in the dark. The Maine coast was entirely unconcerned with either of them, which was one of the things Camille had always found useful about large bodies of water. Their comprehensive indifference to human difficulty. It put things in a proportion that most other environments didn't. She changed the math, Cole said finally. Sophie, she just walked into the hallway and changed what was possible. He turned to look at Camille. You know what I think about sometimes? I think about if her caregiver hadn't been delayed that day. If she'd never lost her orientation in the lobby, we'd never have had a reason to talk. She'd have found another reason, Camille said. Cole thought about this. Yeah, he said, probably. She's relentless about the things she's certain of, Camille said. She gets it from somewhere. Her mother, Cole said. Partially, Camille said. He smiled. The real one, the one that arrived without announcement. The foundation they established 9 months after the wedding was Camille's idea in its original form and Cole's in its execution, which was how most of their significant shared projects organized themselves. She saw the shape of what was needed. He figured out how to build it. They called it the Barrett Westbrook Foundation, which had taken a mildly contentious 20 minutes to arrive at because Cole's first position was that it should just be the Westbrook Foundation since it was her money and her company and her platform. And Camille's position was that it was both of theirs, and she was not going to have a foundation named after a marriage she was in. That didn't include her husband's name. And Cole had looked at the word husband applied to himself with the slightly dazed quality he occasionally got when the full reality of his life's current configuration landed on him fresh. The foundation focused on 3 things: mobility technology and independence training for visually impaired children, educational support for single-parent households with limited income, and vocational transition programs for veterans re-entering civilian workforce. The third category had been Cole's addition, stated simply at the kitchen table one evening when they'd been working through the foundation's scope document. There are a lot of people who did what I did and came out the other side without knowing what to do with themselves, he said. I got lucky. I found work that kept me functional, and I found Maddie, and eventually, he glanced at Camille. Eventually things lined up. But a lot of guys I served with didn't have that. They had the skills and no infrastructure for translating them. Then that's the third pillar, Camille said. He looked at her. Just like that? Cole, she said, you don't have to make a case to me for things that are clearly right. He went back to the document. But she saw what happened in his expression in the moment before he did. The specific quality of a man who had spent long enough arguing for his own worth that he had not yet entirely recalibrated to an environment where it was simply assumed. She understood that. She understood that it would take time, and that her role in it was not to fix it or rush it, but to simply keep being consistent, keep being the same person in every room, the way Cole himself was the same person in every room, and let the consistency do what consistency did, which was eventually to become the thing a person built their certainty on. Sophie, now 10, was learning the city. Not the mansion, not Westbrook Tower, not the specific routes between familiar places. The city in its genuine breadth, with Cole and a new mobility trainer named Enrique, who had worked with visually impaired athletes, and who approached the project with a competitive seriousness that Sophie found, to everyone's relief, genuinely motivating. They mapped the neighborhood around the mansion first, then expanded outward in systematic increments, and Sophie moved through each new territory with the particular methodology Cole had given her in the beginning: sound, air pressure, the geography of noise, refined now by 2 years of additional practice into something that was less like compensation and more like fluency. She was not fearless. Camille was careful not to mistake Sophie's competence for the absence of difficulty, because that mistake would have been another version of not seeing her clearly, and seeing Sophie clearly was the thing Camille worked hardest at. Sophie had bad days. She had days when the mapping failed, and she lost orientation in a familiar space, and the frustration came out in ways that were not graceful. Slammed doors, sharp words, the tearful exhaustion of a child who was tired of working twice as hard for half the information everyone else got for free. On those days, Cole did what he had always done, which was to sit near her without crowding her and wait. And when the space opened up, he'd say something practical and low, and she'd follow the thread of it back to steadiness. Not every time. Sometimes she didn't want the thread, wanted to be left alone with the difficulty. And he would recognize that too, and give her the room. And the recognition itself was a kind of support. Maddie, now 9, had become Sophie's most reliable companion in the independent navigation project. She walked beside Sophie through new spaces the way a good navigator accompanied a pilot, not directing, not anticipating every obstacle, but present and honest when asked. She would say, "There's a planter coming up on your left about 6 steps," without any quality of managing Sophie, more the quality of sharing information between equals. Camille watched this and thought about what those two had built between them, starting with a conversation in a lobby and a demonstration of the iron trellis and the sounds that moved through it. It had not been arranged by any adult. It had organized itself out of proximity and genuine liking, which was the best way, which was actually the only real way. A year after the foundation launched, at a small gathering to mark the milestone, Camille was asked to say a few words about why they'd started it. She said the things that were true about access and equity and the structural gaps that made invisible what should be visible. She said them well because she'd thought about them carefully and believed them and was good at putting things in order. Then Enrique, who had been with the foundation since its 2nd month, asked Sophie to say something, and Sophie stood up from her chair with her cane and said, without preparation, "We started it because my mom figured out that the people who are best at something aren't always the ones who look like they should be. And sometimes the only way to see that is to stop looking and start listening." The room was quiet for a moment. Camille looked at her daughter, 10 years old, cane in hand, completely unafraid of the attention, stating a truth that had organized her life since the night she'd walked into a hallway and wrapped her arms around a janitor's waist, and thought about the gathering in the ballroom, the 5 men in their careful suits, the marble floor, and the soft light, and all of Camille's careful preparation, and how completely it had all missed the point. She had been trying to find a man who looked like the right answer. Sophie had been listening for one. And what Sophie had heard, in the particular quiet between the sounds of an ordinary hallway, was a man already doing the work, already being patient, already paying the kind of attention that most people reserved for things they were being evaluated on. Not because someone was watching, not because it served him in any observable way, because that was who he was at 11:40 in the evening on a Thursday when he thought no one was paying attention to anything but his clipboard. That was the thing about character, Camille thought, that she had understood intellectually for years and understood differently now. It wasn't what you did when the stakes were visible. It was what you did at 11:40 on a Thursday in an empty hallway when the only person who could possibly notice was a 9-year-old girl who couldn't see your face. Cole, sitting beside her at the foundation gathering, had heard Sophie's statement. Camille could see in his expression the particular thing that happened when something landed on him that he hadn't prepared for. Not emotion exactly, more like recognition, the look of a man hearing something he'd known in his body for a long time stated clearly for the first time. He caught Camille watching him. She didn't look away. He reached over and took her hand under the table, without any particular drama, the way you take someone's hand when you've been doing it long enough that the gesture has worn down to its essential form. After the gathering, when Enrique had taken Sophie and Maddie to get ice cream as part of a tradition he'd established that nobody had asked him to establish, but that everyone had immediately ratified, Camille and Cole sat on the foundation building's small front steps in the late afternoon light, the city moving past them in its ordinary velocity. "She's something," Cole said. "Not about anyone specific, about the whole shape of things." "She always was," Camille said. "I just didn't always know how to see it." "You saw it," Cole said. "You chose work that gave her room to be who she is. You built a life around her actual self, not the version that would have been easier to manage." Camille looked at him. "I made a lot of mistakes." "Yeah," he said. "So did I." He turned his hand over on his knee, looked at it briefly. "I kept myself so small for so long that I almost convinced myself it was enough. The apartment, the shift, Maddie's after-school schedule, the model on the coffee table." A pause. "It was enough to survive. It wasn't enough to actually live." "What changed it?" He looked at her with the directness that had never varied in any room or any context or any moment between them. "A 9-year-old grabbed me by the waist in a hallway and refused to let go," he said. "And then her mother came around the corner and looked at me like she was trying to solve a problem she hadn't expected to be interesting." Camille laughed. "I was not—" "You were absolutely doing that." "I was processing," she said. "You were solving," he said. "You solve things. It's the first thing I noticed about you. The way you walked through that building, everything was being assessed. Not aggressively, just constantly." "Is that a flaw?" she said, not entirely jokingly. "It's you," he said. "I'd rather know who you actually are than have you edit it for palatability." He looked at the street. "You assessed me and eventually decided I wasn't a problem. That was good enough." "Considerably more than not a problem," she said. "I know that now," he said. "Took me a while to believe it." They sat on the steps as the afternoon moved toward evening. The city carried on around them, indifferent and enormous, full of the ordinary noise of people living their lives in the available light. Somewhere around the corner, Sophie was arguing with Maddie about ice cream flavors in the way they argued about everything, with full commitment and no lasting consequence, the argument already the beginning of an agreement. Camille listened to the sound of her daughter's voice, its specific quality, the confidence it had grown into, the way it moved through space without apology, and thought about a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table 11 months after her husband died with a company to rebuild and a child to raise, and a particular kind of loneliness that was specific to people who were very capable and had no one who fully matched them. She had tried to solve it the way she solved everything, with preparation, with research, with 5 carefully vetted candidates and a dinner party in a lit room. And Sophie, with no eyes and perfect hearing and 9 years of learning to trust what she could not see, had walked past all of it and found the answer in a hallway. The answer had been there the whole time, moving quietly through the building, doing the work, being exactly who he was in every room, at every hour, whether anyone was watching or not. The only thing required had been the willingness to stop looking at the surface and listen for what was underneath. That was the lesson. That was what Sophie had known from the beginning and what the rest of them had needed a year to catch up to. Not that the world owed you legibility, not that worth always announced itself in ways the eye could catch, but that if you went quiet enough and paid attention with more than just your eyes, the truth of a person had a sound to it. And if you were lucky, not careful, not strategic, just lucky in the particular way that required you to be paying attention when luck arrived, you would hear it in a hallway, and you would know.